Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a real intellectual mystery based on the research paper When the Content Isn't Doing the Work, a control ladder for falsifying learned sparse routing on synthetic hierarchies. I know, it's quite a mouthful. But what we're really talking about here is the wild world of AI testing, specifically machine learning models and something called sparse routing. At its core, this is a detective story about catching an AI cheating on its test. We're going to explore how incredibly sophisticated AI architectures can create a brilliant illusion of success, and how a truly rigorous methodology finally caught them in the act. Right out of the gate, we get this incredibly ominous warning from our source material, the methodological hazard. It perfectly sets up the central mystery of our explainer. Just because a machine learning model spits out the right answer or posts a really clean alignment score, it doesn't mean it's actually doing the work its creators claim it's doing. Sometimes that success is purely an illusion.
All right, part one, the illusion of success, the trap of geometric priors. Let's get into it.
So what is this trap? It revolves around something called geometric priors. Think of these as built-in architectural biases, like hyperbolic geometry, designed to help an AI understand structured data, like hierarchical trees. And here's the kicker. On the surface, they look amazing. They totally crush the basic baselines. But are they actually doing what we think they're doing? Often, these models are just throwing up a denser coverage mask or leaning on simple proximity to cheat their way to the right answer. It turns out, standard AI validation tools are frequently just too weak. They let these models slide right by with convincing false positives, without genuinely doing the hard work of routing information.
Which brings us to part two. Meet the interrogator, the control ladder. Picture this as the ultimate lie detector for neural networks. It's a rigorous falsification protocol, a ladder, basically, built by an independent researcher to catch AI architectures taking shortcuts. Every single rung on this ladder strips away one specific false advantage. It systematically tests whether a fancy geometric structure is actually improving the AI's routing, or if it's all just a mirage.
Let's look at three of the most brutal interrogation steps on this ladder. First up, coverage matching. Basically, you don't get to win just because your AI happens to look at more connections than the baseline. We equalize the active edges. Second, the distance local null. This tests if your complex geometry is actually doing anything better than just picking the closest data points. And third, mask in the loss. This is where we completely separate the representation from the routing, forcing the AI to actually predict something useful downstream using the mask itself. Honestly, it is a grueling gauntlet.
Moving on to part three. Suspect number one, the geometry prior. It's time to cross-examine our first suspect, the alum hypothesis. So alum was this hyperbolic cross-mask that initially looked brilliant. The claim was that its radial and angular channels perfectly captured ancestral and sibling relationships in data. But put it under cross-examination on the very first rung of our ladder, that coverage matching step, and alum's alibi completely falls apart. That huge apparent win? Just a mechanical artifact. It literally just had more active edges turned on than the baseline. Once we equalize that, poof, the advantage evaporated completely.
Okay, but what about the big core claim? The widely held idea that hyperbolic routing definitively beats standard Euclidean space for hierarchical data? Well, this perfectly illustrates the power of that mask in the loss rung. By separating the geometry of the representation from the geometry of the actual routing, our interrogator forced the hyperbolic mask into a downstream prediction task. And the result? It completely failed to beat a super simple, independently fitted Euclidean mask.
Now there was one last place to hide, the low-dimensional loophole. See, hyperbolic theory predicts that its absolute strongest advantage kicks in at exactly dimension 2. So researchers brought in the heavy artillery, a highly validated tool called the Geo-Optramonian Atom Optimizer, giving the model the absolute best possible chance at a perfectly healthy fit. Yet even here, it failed against basic Euclidean routing. Loophole closed. The detective definitively proved the geometry simply wasn't doing the work.
Part 4. Fixing the leaky test, hardening the interrogation room. Before we bring in our next suspect, our detective realizes something terrifying. The testing room itself is leaking the answers. The source details a massive instrument hardening arc. Look at these 6 massive vulnerabilities. From selection rule welding to a biased empirical null, the testbed itself was practically giving the AI the answers, letting it bypass the actual routing question entirely. Every single one of these leaks had to be systematically hunted down and repaired.
To give you an idea, let's zoom in on just one of these leaks: transductive family leakage. Think of this like a student who figures out the teacher's exact grading rubric instead of actually studying the subject matter. The model wasn't learning how to route information to find the parent node. Nope, it was just memorizing that certain sibling nodes always had a specific family label during training. It was a cheap identity trick, a total evaluation artifact. Fixing this required building entirely isolated, held-out payload worlds just so the test could finally pose a clean question. Which brings us to part 5, suspect number 2, the content router, and an attribution reversal. Enter suspect number 2 on our shiny, newly hardened testbed, the learned content router. The big claim here is that by looking at the actual content, the payload of the nodes, it can discover hidden, structurally distant sources that simple geometric proximity messes. And at first glance, it looks guilty of being absolutely brilliant. It beats the baseline and successfully closes almost 22% of the gap to a perfect Oracle model. It seems to definitively prove that content routing works. But hold on just a second. The detective decides to run one final, absolutely devastating control test. And this is the smoking gun of our entire explainer. They introduced a capacity-matched control router. But here's the catch. This control model was completely blind to the content. It was restricted to seeing absolutely nothing but pairwise distances, 0 payload bits. And you know what happened? The blind, distance-only control completely crushed the content router. This is the mind-blowing twist. That blind router, stripped of all content data, closed nearly 44% of the gap. It literally doubled the performance of the content router, which means all that apparent success we thought the content router had, 0% of it was actually attributable to reading the content. So how in the world did this happen? Well, as the paper perfectly puts it, rank-based unreachability is not distance anonymity. Basically, to test the AI, the target node was hidden from the basic nearest k-selection rule. But hiding its rank didn't hide its underlying geometric signature. A flexibly enough model just looked at the geometry, spotted the signature, and routed straight to it without ever needing to read a single piece of content. The AI found a geometric side channel, and it took it. Finally, part 6, the verdict. The method is the message. As we wrap up this investigation, we've got to look at what's left standing after this brutal gauntlet. The flashy, hyperbolic geometries, dead. The learned content router, overturned by its own capacity control. So what actually survived? Well, 2 things. First, a super simple, geometry-agnostic structured distance locality. Turns out, just checking nearby nodes works incredibly well. And second, the falsification protocol itself. The incredibly rigorous falsifier-first control ladder methodology absolutely proved its enduring value for the future of AI. The specific models might have failed, but the testing method triumphed, which leaves us with this incredibly provocative thought to chew on. When you see massive headlines making bold claims about new AI capabilities and architectures, you have to stop and ask, if the AI isn't really doing the work, are your tests? We have to demand better testing methodologies, demand matched capacity controls, and never, ever accept the illusion of success at face value. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you on the next one.